The wind howled, tearing at Lila's hair as she stood on the jagged edge of the beach, staring at the sea that seemed to scream back. She was 18, and the world felt too heavy, too sharp, like the rocks cutting into her bare feet. Somewhere in the salt-soaked air, she heard her mother's voice, faint but piercing. "You're nothing but a disappointment." Lila clutched the shell in her pocket, its smooth curve a lifeline against the storm in her chest. She'd run here, to this forgotten stretch of coast, after the fight that had shattered her family's fragile peace. Her mother's words had been a knife, slicing through years of unspoken love, leaving only the raw truth. Lila had never felt like she belonged. Not in that house, not in her own skin. The beach was her escape, a place where the ocean's roar drowned out the echoes of her failure. She didn't notice the old woman at first. The figure appeared as if conjured from the mist, her silver hair glowing faintly under the bruised sky. She wore a tattered shawl, her eyes sharp like the glint of sea glass. "You're carrying a heavy heart, girl," the woman said, her voice low, almost lost in the wind. Lila froze, her hand tightening around the shell. She hadn't told anyone she was here. No one knew. "Who are you?" Lila asked, her voice trembling, half from the cold, half from something deeper in instinct that this moment wasn't ordinary. The woman smiled, her face creasing like the folds of a well-worn map. "Just someone who knows this beach better than most." She reached into her shawl and pulled out a shell, small and pearlescent, its surface catching the faint light. "This is for you. It's from the day you were born." Lila's breath caught. The shell in her pocket, the one she'd found years ago as a child, tucked in her mother's drawer, was nearly identical. She pulled it out, her hands shaking, and held it beside the woman's gift. They matched, down to the faint spiral etched into their centers. How do you know about this?" she whispered. The woman's eyes softened, but there was a weight to them, a story unspoken. "The sea keeps secrets, but it also gives answers. Keep that shell close, Lila. It'll show you who you are." Before Lila could ask more, the woman turned and walked into the fog, her figure dissolving as if she'd never been there. Lila stood alone, the two shells heavy in her hands, her heart pounding with questions. The day she was born? How could a stranger know her name, her story? She looked at the ocean, its waves crashing with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely lost. The next morning, Lila woke in her car, parked at the edge of the cliffs. The shells lay on the passenger seat, glinting in the dawn light. She hadn't dreamed of the woman, the words, the impossible gift. She traced the spiral on the new shell, her mind racing. Her mother had never spoken of her birth, only vague mentions of a hospital, a stormy night, and a father who left before Lila could know him. The shell from her childhood had been her only anchor, a mystery she'd clung to when her mother's coldness grew unbearable. She drove to the small coastal town nearby, a place called Haven's End, where the locals knew every storm and every shipwreck. The diner was her first stop, a weathered building with peeling paint and the smell of coffee and fried fish. Inside, she asked about the old woman, describing her silver hair and sharp eyes. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind but tired face, shook her head. "No one like that around here, hon. Sounds like you met a ghost." Lila laughed nervously, but the waitress's words lingered. She spent the day wandering Haven's End, asking fishermen, shopkeepers, anyone who might know something. Most shook their heads, but an old man at the pier, his hands gnarled from years of hauling nets, paused when she mentioned the shell. "That spiral," he said, squinting at it. "Old folks used to say shells like that were gifts from the sea, meant for someone special, born under a certain sky." "What sky?" Lila pressed, her pulse quickening. He shrugged, spitting into the water. "Dunno. My grandma used to talk about a storm, one that came the night a child was born. Said the sea marked that child with a shell. Superstition, probably." Lila's chest tightened. She thanked him and walked back to the beach, the shells burning in her pocket. The day she was born. A storm. A shell. It was too much to dismiss as coincidence. She sat on the sand, watching the waves, and made a decision. She'd find the old woman again. She had to know the truth. That night, Lila camped on the beach, a small fire crackling under the stars. The shells sat beside her, their surfaces catching the firelight. She couldn't sleep, her mind tangled with questions. Who was the old woman? Why did she know Lila's name? And why did the shells feel like they held a piece of her soul? Around midnight, a sound broke through the waves, a soft hum, like a lullaby. Lila sat up, her heart racing. It was coming from the cliffs, where the rocks formed a natural cave. She grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound, her footsteps crunching on the sand. The cave was small, its entrance barely wide enough for her to slip through. Inside, the air was damp, the walls glistening with salt. The hum grew louder, and then she saw it, a figure crouched in the shadows, a boy no older than 16, his clothes ragged, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Lila demanded, her voice echoing. The boy scrambled back, clutching something to his chest, a shell, just like hers. "I didn't mean to scare you," he stammered. "I heard you asking about the old woman in town. I know her." Lila's breath hitched. "Tell me everything." His name was Eli, and he wasn't from Haven's End. He'd been living in the cave for weeks, hiding from a past he wouldn't share. "The old woman, she found me here," he said, his voice low. "Gave me this shell. Said it was from the day I was born. Said it'd lead me to my family." Lila's hands trembled as she showed him her shells. Eli's eyes widened. "They're the same," he whispered. "She told me to wait here, that someone else would come. Someone connected to me." The cave seemed to close in around them, the hum of the sea louder now, like a chorus of voices. Lila didn't understand, but she felt a thread tying her to Eli, to the shells, to the old woman who seemed to know more than she should. "We need to find her," Lila said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "Together." Eli nodded, his expression a mix of hope and dread. They stepped out of the cave, the shells in their hands, the ocean roaring like it was calling them home. The dawn broke over Haven's End with a quiet ferocity, the sky bleeding red as Lila and Eli walked the beach, their shells tucked close. The weight of their meeting in the cave clung to Lila like damp sand she didn't trust easily, but Eli's haunted eyes mirrored her own. They were strangers, yet the shells in their hands felt like a shared secret, a map to something neither could name. They searched for the old woman, starting at the cliffs where Lila had first seen her. The rocks were slick with seaweed, the air thick with salt and the promise of answers. Eli was quiet, his steps careful, as if he expected the ground to give way. "She's not just some old lady," he said finally, his voice barely above the waves. "She knew things about meetings I never told anyone." Lila glanced at him, her heart twisting. "Like what?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the spiral on his shell. "My mom, she died when I was born. I grew up in foster homes, never knew my dad. The old woman said this shell was from the night I came into the world, during a storm that tore the coast apart. She said it'd lead me to where I belong." Lila stopped walking, the words hitting her like a wave. Her own mother had mentioned a storm, too, the night Lila was born. She hadn't thought much of it until now, but the coincidence was too sharp to ignore. "My mom said something similar," she admitted. "About a storm. But she never talks about it. Or about me, really." Eli's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. They kept moving, combing the beach for any sign of the old woman. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, but the cliffs remained empty, the fog thick and unyielding. Lila's hope began to fray, replaced by a gnawing frustration. "What if she's gone?" she said, kicking a pebble into the surf. "What if this is all just nothing?" Eli didn't answer right away. He crouched by the water, picking up a piece of driftwood and turning it over in his hands. "She's real," he said finally. "I felt it when she gave me the shell. Like she was giving me a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." Lila wanted to believe him, but doubt was a familiar shadow. She sat on a rock, pulling out her shells and studying them. The spirals seemed to pulse in the sunlight, almost alive. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the old woman's face, her words. "It'll show you who you are." By noon, they reached the edge of Haven's End, where the beach gave way to a narrow path leading to an abandoned lighthouse. It stood crooked against the sky, its paint chipped, its windows dark. Something about it pulled at Lila, a tug she couldn't explain. "Let's check it out," she said, her voice firm despite the unease in her chest. Eli followed, his silence heavier now. The lighthouse door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a spiral staircase coated in dust. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rust and forgotten things. They climbed, their footsteps echoing, until they reached the top, where a cracked window offered a view of the endless sea. That's when they found it. A small wooden box tucked in a corner, its lid carved with the same spiral as their shells. Lila's heart raced as she opened it, revealing a bundle of yellowed letters tied with twine. The handwriting was elegant, faded but clear, addressed to someone named Clara. Lila's breath caught. Clara was her mother's name. She unfolded the top letter, her hands trembling. It was dated 18 years ago, the year she was born. The words were a confession, raw and aching. I couldn't keep them both, not after the storm. The sea took so much, but it gave me you, my darling Clara. I left one shell for her, one for him, hoping they'd find their way back. Lila's vision blurred with tears. Him? She whispered, looking at Eli. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the letter. He didn't need to say it knew. The shells, the storm, the old woman. They were connected, not just to the sea, but to each other. The twist came like a rogue wave. As Lila and Eli sat in the lighthouse, reading through the letters, a shadow moved in the doorway. It wasn't the old woman, but a man middle-aged, with weathered skin and eyes that carried the same sharpness as the woman on the beach. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice gruff but laced with something softer, like regret. Who are you? Lila demanded, clutching the letters. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to the shells in their hands. My name's Thomas. I knew your mother, Clara. A long time ago. Eli stood, his body tense. You knew her? How? Thomas sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I was there the night you were born. Both of you. He looked at Lila, then Eli, his expression breaking. Clara was my wife. And you're my children. The words hit Lila like a physical blow. She stumbled back, the letters slipping from her hands. Eli's shell fell to the floor, clattering against the wood. No, she whispered. That's impossible. My mom said my father left before I was born. Thomas's eyes filled with pain. I didn't leave by choice. The storm had changed everything. Clara thought I was dead. I thought I'd lost you both. Lila's mind spun, the pieces of her life rearranging into something new, something impossible. Eli was her brother. The shells were a promise, a tether to a family she'd never known. And the old woman, whoever she was, had brought them here, to this moment. We need to find her, Lila said, her voice shaking but resolute. The old woman. She started this. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. She's no stranger to this coast. Some say she's more than human, a keeper of stories, of truths the sea holds tight. If you want answers, you'll need to go deeper. To the heart of the storm. Lila looked at Eli, then at the shells in her hands. The sea was calling, and she wasn't afraid anymore. The lighthouse became their anchor, a fragile shelter against the truth that had upended Lila's world. She sat on the cold floor, the letters scattered around her, each one a fragment of a life she'd never known. Eli was her brother, her twin, born in the same storm, marked by the same sea. Thomas, their father, stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky, his silence louder than the waves below. Lila traced the spiral on her shell, her mind grappling with Thomas's story. He'd been a fisherman, young and reckless, in love with Clara. The night of the storm, he'd been out at sea, caught in a tempest that sank his boat. He'd washed ashore miles away, half dead, and by the time he returned, Clara was gone, taking one child, Lila, with her. The other, Eli, had been given up, lost to the system. The shells, Thomas said, were Clara's promise, left with each child to bind them to their origins. Why didn't she tell me? Lila asked, her voice raw. She acted like I was a burden, like I ruined her life. Thomas's face crumpled. Clara was broken by the storm. She thought I was gone, thought she had to survive alone. She never stopped loving you, Lila, but grief, it twists people. Eli, sitting cross-legged beside her, hadn't spoken since Thomas's revelation. His shell lay in his lap, his fingers hovering over it like he was afraid to touch it. And the old woman? He asked finally. How does she fit into this? Thomas shook his head. I don't know, but she's been on this coast longer than anyone remembers. Some say she's tied to the sea itself, guiding lost souls back to their truths. Lila's chest ached, a mix of anger and longing. She wanted to confront her mother, to demand answers, but more than that, she wanted to find the old woman. She stood, brushing the dust from her jeans. We're going back to the beach. She's out there, and I'm not stopping until I find her. They left the lighthouse as dusk settled, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Thomas led them to a cove he called the Hollow, a place where the waves carved tunnels into the cliffs. "If she's anywhere, it's here," he said, his voice low. "The old folks say this is where the sea speaks." The cove was eerie, the cliffs looming like silent giants. Lila's flashlight beam danced across the rocks, catching glints of quartz and seaweed. Eli stayed close, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet intensity. They searched for hours, calling out to the old woman, but the only answer was the relentless crash of the waves. Then, a flicker of movement, a shadow near the water's edge. Lila's heart leapt as she ran toward it, her boots slipping on the rocks. It wasn't the old woman, but a girl, no older than 12, her hair tangled with salt and sand. She held a shell, identical to theirs, her eyes wide with fear and wonder. "Who are you?" Lila asked, her voice softer now, sensing the girl's fragility. The girl clutched her shell tighter. "I'm Mara. She gave me this, said it was from the day I was born." Her voice trembled, but there was a fierceness in her gaze, a mirror of Lila's own defiance. Eli knelt beside her, his expression softening. "The old woman? Silver hair, sharp eyes?" Mara nodded. "She said I'd find others. People like me." Lila's stomach twisted. Another child, another shell. She looked at Thomas, who was staring at Mara like he'd seen a ghost. "Is she?" Lila couldn't finish the question. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "Clara was pregnant again when I left. I didn't know she had another child." Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She held out her shell, its spiral catching the moonlight. "She said the sea would bring us together, that we're family." Lila's knees buckled. She sank to the sand, the weight of it all crashing down. Eli, her twin. Mara, her sister. Thomas, her father. And the old woman, weaving their lives together with shells and secrets. The sea roared around them, a chorus of grief and hope, and Lila felt something shift inside her, a spark of belonging, fragile but real. They brought Mara back to the lighthouse, where Thomas built a fire to warm her. She told them her story, raised by a foster family, always drawn to the coast, finding the old woman just days ago. Each word was a thread, tying them closer, but the old woman remained a mystery, a shadow just out of reach. Lila couldn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the sea, the shells heavy in her hands. The old woman wasn't just guiding them, she was pulling them toward something bigger, something tied to the storm that had shaped their lives. Lila felt it in her bones, a truth waiting to be uncovered. "We need to go to the heart of the hollow," she said at dawn, her voice steady. "That's where she'll be." Eli and Mara nodded, their faces set with determination. Thomas hesitated, his eyes clouded with fear. "The hollow's dangerous," he warned. "The tides are unpredictable, and the caves, they're not just rock. They feel alive." Lila met his gaze, her heart pounding but resolute. "I don't care. I need to know who she is. I need to know why." The sea was calling, and Lila was ready to answer. The hollow was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, its tunnels carved by centuries of relentless waves. Lila led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, Eli and Mara close behind. Thomas brought up the rear, his steps heavy with the weight of a past he couldn't outrun. The air was thick, the walls slick with salt, and the sea's roar echoed like a heartbeat, urging them deeper. Lila's hands shook as she clutched her shells, their spirals of faint glow in the dim light. She didn't know what she'd find, but the old woman's words haunted her. "It'll show you who you are." The truth was close, she could feel it, sharp and heavy, like a storm about to break. The tunnel opened into a cavern, vast and glittering with crystals embedded in the walls. At its center stood the old woman, her silver hair catching the faint light, her eyes calm but piercing. She didn't look surprised to see them. "You've come," she said, her voice carrying the weight of the sea itself. Lila stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Who are you? Why did you give us these shells?" The old woman smiled, but it was a sad, knowing smile. "I'm no one, and I'm everyone. I'm the keeper of this coast, the one who listens when the sea speaks." She gestured to the shells in their hands. "Those are its gifts, given to you the night you were born, the night the storm tried to take you, but the sea refused to let you go." Eli's voice was sharp, cutting through the cavern's hum. "What does that mean? Why us?" The old woman's gaze softened, resting on each of them: Lila, Eli, Mara, and Thomas. You were born in the heart of a storm that changed this coast forever. Your mother, Clara, stood on this very beach, begging the sea to spare her children. It listened. It marked you with these shells, a promise that you'd find each other again. Lila's throat tightened. My mother, she never told me. She carried her own pain, the old woman said. She thought she'd lost Thomas, thought she'd failed you. But the sea doesn't forget. It brought you here, to this moment. Mara, small but fierce, stepped forward, her shell held high. Are you my grandmother? The old woman laughed, a sound like waves on pebbles. No, child. I'm older than that, older than this coast. I'm the one who carries the stories the sea tells, the one who guides the lost back to their truths. Thomas's voice broke the silence, raw and trembling. I failed them. I wasn't there. The old woman's eyes hardened, but not with cruelty. You survived, Thomas. That was your fight. Now it's theirs to reclaim what was lost. The cavern seemed to pulse, the crystals glowing brighter, the sea's song louder. Lila felt the shells in her hands grow warm, their spirals almost alive. She looked at Eli and Mara, her brother and sister, and felt a connection she'd never known she needed. The pain of her mother's distance, the years of feeling like a mistake didn't vanish, but it softened, reshaped by the truth of her family. What do we do now? Lila asked, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. The old woman stepped closer, her hand brushing Lila's cheek, cold but gentle. Love, carry the shells, and they'll remind you who you are. The sea gave you to each other, don't let that gift go to waste. She turned, her shawl trailing like mist, and walked toward the cavern's edge, where the sea churned below. Before Lila could call out, she was gone, her figure dissolving into the spray. The cavern fell silent, the crystals dimming, but the shells still glowed, a quiet promise. They emerged from the hollow as dawn broke, the sky clear for the first time in days. Lila held her shells, Eli and Mara beside her, Thomas trailing behind. They were a family, fractured but whole, bound by the sea and its secrets. Lila didn't know what came next, how to face her mother, how to build a life with a brother and sister she'd just found, but she wasn't afraid. The beach stretched before them, the waves calm now, whispering instead of roaring. Lila knelt by the water, letting it lap at her fingers. She thought of her mother, of the pain they'd both carried, and made a silent promise to find her, to heal what had been broken. Eli touched her shoulder, his shell in his hand. We'll do it together, he said, his voice steady. Mara nodded, her small hand clutching hers. We're family. Thomas stood a few steps back, his eyes on the horizon. I'll be here, he said simply. For all of you. Lila smiled, the shells warm against her skin. The sea had given her more than a mystery, it had given her a home.